don't start with pricing, start with assessing value, quantifying it, understanding it, getting your handle on what value is with a specific feature or a product, how it scales, how customers perceive it, where do they start, where do they end.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for in eBay.
I mean, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the intimate relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and our guest today is Sagar Thakur, and here are three things you want to know about Sagar before we start. He is the business planning and pricing strategy guy at Outreach. He worked in SaaS Monetization Strategy at VMware, which sounds incredibly impressive. And he plays way too many instruments. I'm lucky to play the harmonica. Welcome, Sagar.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. Love being on this show.
Well, good. It'll be fun. So how did you get into pricing?
How did I end up in pricing? I think it was a bit of an accident, if you ask me. Like, I actually started my career in sales, not in the software industry at all. So I used to work as a key account manager dealing with shipping companies. So I was part of an oil company, British Petroleum. So I ran in the sales career. Like, I actually managed a sales team at a point in time. So I was, up the way up the chain in terms of building a sales career. But then I was looking to do something which was more sort of broad-based, impactful versus a particular function, so to speak, so sales or marketing and so on and so forth. So my transition to pricing sort of happened at the intersection when I moved to the United States from India, looking for a job, sort of like, all right, what do I got to do, right? And so after talking to many folks here in my family and sort of accidentally started in a product marketing role because an oil and gas software company thought I'd have an interesting perspective. So I started as a product marketing guy, but I picked up a lot of value, pricing stuff in my sales roles, given my analytical sort of mindset. So I started off as a pricing analyst, supporting pricing full time because that was the need of the hour at the time and people thought I was good at it. And so from there on, it's just been, I've been fully engaged in this role for the last 7-8 years. And this is my third software pricing gig at this point, Mark.
Nice. And so if you're allowed to talk about it, tell us about what you did at VMware, because I just find anybody who can do monetization strategy is fascinating.
Yeah, I think VMware, being a large organization, like many other large organizations, has a dedicated pricing team, right? Smaller organizations are probably 1, 2, 3 odd people.
Or none.
Or none for a lot of cases, right? VMware had a large scale monetization team, right? So my role was different. Like, those pricing individuals who were responsible for developing sort of strategy for a specific business unit, because the VMware company was pretty diverse in terms of the types of software they had. But my role was to help them sort of necessarily operate a center of excellence in terms of how we look at evaluating a licensing metric, how we look at developing, what kind of packaging frameworks exist for different business units to attain. So I was sort of working on the center of excellence piece in terms of standardizing different layers in terms of so that we can simplify the offering to the customer. Like, you don't want 23 units of measures and 3 different packaging models and different volume structures across VMware. So if customers buying VMware software, it cannot be that complex, right? So a lot of my role was a center of excellence sort of strategy role that way. So that was my core function. But again, I did work on specific pricing projects.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, because it's really fascinating. When you get to be a really large company like VMware, it becomes hard to do lots of different pricing metrics. So you can't take each product and each market segment and say, hey, I'm going to charge these guys for users and these guys for clicks and these guys for downloads. And yet there's a trade-off, because when I switch to say I'm going to charge everybody based on users, we lose a lot. How do you think about that trade-off?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's sort of this actually kept me up at night at the time, because I was at VMware, because that was I was looking at those trade-offs on a daily basis, so to speak. I don't think there's necessarily a right, an absolute prescriptive right way to do it. I think it starts from organizing the product portfolio in a way that makes sense. And a lot of these large companies have these challenges where their product portfolio is sort of not organized into logical buckets. So when you acquire companies, they're like, okay, this fits here, and then realize, actually, you know what, actually this is more complementary to this product set. So if you can organize the product portfolio correctly, or sort of like something that's more impactful from a customer buying perspective, then you can say, okay, for this set of product portfolio, are there, can we apply one metric or a set of metrics that are related to each other, and then can go about that business, right? So you're right in the sense that it's challenging to sort of look at every individual piece, which I would, as a pricing person, want to see what's the value of each of the key pieces. But it really started by organizing the product portfolio and helping shape that. And some of that feedback happens from product strategy line. Some of that comes from the monetization team. Like, hey, this is not really fitting. But yeah, I don't, there's trade-offs. I've seen companies like a Workday, for example, where for the longest time they ran with a single pricing metric, like number of employees, for example. So everything was indexed to that. So from a simplicity standpoint, it helped. But once you hit a sort of a growth wall where like, okay, this is not making sense for a lot of new stuff that we're doing, that's when you sort of try and break out of that. So I think there's, again, you can err on the side of complexity or simplicity. In general, simplicity is better until you can make sense. But then if the trade-offs become too steep, now you need to add healthy complexity, as I call it, from that perspective.
Yeah, it almost seems like there's a U-shaped curve where startups really need to start simple. They need to get more complex. And then as you get too big, it's just way too cumbersome to manage tons of different pricing metrics. So we have to go back to simple again.
Correct. No, absolutely. I think that's a good insight, because you can see it from the sellers when they're sort of confused from a point of view of like, how many things are we measuring, and from a buyer's lens as well. So having a pulse from a seller and buyer perspective is probably the best way. But you're absolutely right. That's a great insight in terms of that seesaw of too simple, too complex, and what the healthy trade-off is, so to speak. So
we're going to talk a little bit about the role of pricing today. And what do you think about a pricing job, right? You've been in it now 7-8 years. You didn't expect to be in it. Is it interesting? Is it rewarding? Is it a career developer? What do you think about it?
Yeah, and I think to paint a more realistic picture, I'll look at both, what's the positive, sort of the opportunity side of things, and what are the challenges that, I don't want people to get into a pricing role and realize, oh crap, this is not for me for XYZ reasons, so to speak, right? I'll start with the challenging part, because that may be, just to set a baseline and then look at like, okay, so if you're okay with these challenges, let's look at the opportunities. That makes sense, right? So from a challenging perspective, one is that it is one of, or at least I'm being biased here, but it's a hard job fundamentally. And the reason for that is that it is so fundamental to a business that you suddenly like, is this one individual responsible for like owning pricing? Because there's like so many dependencies. There's dependencies on the product side, dependencies on sellers and their ability to articulate value. There's dependencies on operations in terms of how you can transact. There's just dependencies across pretty much every single function, so to speak. So it suddenly can feel overwhelming. Like, monetization is like the entire organization is focused on creating value, like, but who's focused on capture? And that drives the business, so to speak. And the first answer, like, that should be the CEO, like, especially in a younger company. So it can feel very overwhelming. It's a hard job. Like Dharmesh from HubSpot on one of his LinkedIn posts says it's the second hardest job in SaaS. I forget what the first one was. But it's just hard because everyone experiences pricing, and so they have an opinion. So, having strategic alignment, getting everyone on the same page, or maybe not, okay. It's just hard.
So I want to flip what you just said. By the way, I agree 100%. It is hard, right? It is. I think most pricing people get into it because we tend to be more logical, left brain, numerical. We like numbers. And it is a very right brain social skill to do it well, because every single department cares, touches it, wants to know what you're doing, wants to influence it. And so the opposite of what you said is true. It may be hard, but oh my gosh, it's so cool because I get to see every department in the company.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great insight. I think this is where the challenges and the opportunities duality is, right? Because you touch so many pieces, at the same time, the breadth of exposure that you can get in the 7-8 years, not only have I sat in different teams, like I've sat in the sales operations, I've sat in product management, I've sat in product marketing, I've directly reported to the CFO. Like there's all sorts of, like, depending on where the need of the hour is, the level of exposure that you get is just, phenomenal if you're sort of up for it from a curiosity lens. And then if you think from a career development standpoint, you can also then go into these different directions, right? So I've interviewed with a lot of folks who are ex-pricing people and gone into something else, right? So someone's got into like if you're really interested in like the beginning of the customer journey, where like trials and sort of like acquiring customers. So you can get into like customer acquisition strategy from a marketing lens. You can get into a strategy role. You can get into a product management role because it's so intimate with the product as well. So the pathways are just many, but the initial sort of exposure and skills that you develop, you mentioned the social aspect of it, which is like, I totally and I still continue to underestimate the social and the storytelling aspect of it, like being able to bring the sales team along on why we're doing something, right? Because every salespeople like, yeah, in this deal, I acquired this portion and therefore this pricing doesn't work and, that kind of stuff. So the ability to narrate a story of why is it that we're doing what we're doing and being able to support that, it's completely, sort of a social / creative / like engagement kind of a job versus what most people think as an engineering sort of like analyze and say, this is the perfect price. Because dirty little secret in pricing is that there is no mathematically correct answer. It's a range of solutions which is possible. Right. But no, back to your point, I think the challenge and the opportunity sort of have two sides of the coin, if that makes sense.
Well, speaking of career development, though, it was probably a couple years ago, I interviewed a person who came out of pricing, and he was the VP of innovation at Black & Decker. And I just thought that was so cool because if you think about it, if you're in pricing, you're always thinking about what do customers value.
Totally. That's fascinating. In fact, if you ask me what my dream job would be, I think that would be sort of it because, and many folks have written about this in terms of like, okay, so there's a lot of innovation in the product side in the tech space, but less of value capture. So like what innovation is valuable and how do you assess that is like I'm sure many product teams struggle with that. Many companies struggle with that. But that's fascinating. I'm glad that someone took up a
now you have hope.
Role. Now I have definitely hope. I definitely have hope. The horizon is bright.
So let's talk about how do we build a pricing culture inside an organization? Because this is, and is it really a pricing culture or is it a culture of value?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. So the word pricing can be a misnomer that way. Like a lot of people narrow pricing to, just put a dollar number to something is sort of the most common impression that I've picked out there. So the word price, once you say pricing culture, it's sort of like, it's everyone's job to care about like price points and whatnot. That's not true though. I think to your point, like what you're really building is a culture of sort of marrying the value creation and value capture process, that they're sort of intimately tied together. Like you cannot have value creation without capture. Like what's the point? And you cannot have value capture without creating any value. And so you're sort of trying to, put the burden of like, hey, no, it's all about the model. Like, well, no, if there is no value creation, there is no capture, right? So I think to your point in terms of building that, like I've found like, and we can go in depth, obviously, there's the education piece because it's like my job maybe to think about pricing 100%, but for the most people, for a product manager, it's something else. For, head of deal desk, it's something else. Like their, key measurements are different, so to speak. So a lot of time, like it's like a 3-step process. There's education involved in that process, which is like, busting some myths right off the gate. Like, people are like, yeah, I'm building a new feature, it's going to cost a lot, so I better charge something for it. I'm like, just bust that myth. That's not going to happen, so to speak. So a lot of it is just busting a bunch of myths that people have as preconceived notions of what pricing is, so to speak, so that you can open up the possibility for, okay, now that that's aside, like what can we actually do? Which brings to the second stage, which is like empowerment, like give them the structure, the framework to think about value and pricing, whether it's about, measuring value or like conducting qualitative or quantitative research or just understanding inherently the types of value and whatnot, even though it's sort of an abstract concept, but put a boundary around it and actually help define it and give them the tools for what basic, like what's a licensing metric, what does packaging look like, how does that fit in, and so on. And then last piece is the energized piece, which is like show the success, like show that our average deal sizes are improving or our average selling prices are improving or sort of like, hey, we're able to achieve this upsell and things like that. So it sort of like starts from education, moves to empowering, and then because you can't come up with everything on your own, like it has to be a collaborative process. And then it's the energize piece, which is like show the organization that this is helping, so that we can further attach our from a pricing perspective to the growth plans of the company and how that helps, so to speak. So anyway, there's a lot obviously in this, but that's sort of the net of it from my perspective.
I have to say, I really like those 3 E's. I often think about the role of a pricing department inside a big company. And certainly there's a role for someone's got to manage the list price and how do we get it out and who's collecting it, right? So there's very tactical things that have to happen.
Yep.
But then every product manager, every product marketer, every salesperson needs to be thinking about value so that we can capture higher prices.
Totally.
And I think that pricing departments there are much better served as internal consultants, right? So how do I help different departments inside my organization? What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that's super valid, because if you assume that, and I think rightfully so, that pricing is a central piece to the puzzle of any company's sort of growth strategy and like how do they do business and whatnot, then it's similar to product marketing in that sense. Like if you like that's where I've mostly sat, which is like you become the internal consultants because you're tying together different knobs of the business and helping move things forward. And so if you can be that internal sort of consulting partner to these different teams, so that they can then incorporate your thinking into their day-to-day workflows, right? So if I'm a finance person, I'm doing like financial planning and whatnot, I know how pricing is working versus just making a bunch of assumptions and saying, yep, this is my plan. So I think that's a great part. But getting there is the obviously the challenging part, especially as I said, younger stage companies are like, pricing is probably in the last thing that like you set a model and then you're like, all right, forget it, I'm moving on. And then you get into this kludgy place after 3-4 years. We're like, okay, now this is really complicated. And then unwinding it or updating it becomes even more messier. And that further adds to the fact that this pricing voodoo is crazy. And but anyway, no, I think that's a valid.
Yeah, and I also find, since you've mentioned it twice now, I think, or at least I thought of it twice, I often find unwinding the attitude of cost plus pricing is really, really hard. People just have this perception that prices are based on costs. And by the way, we have that perception when we're consumers. So why do we not have that when we're on the selling side? And so I find that hugely challenging.
Yeah, and to add really quickly on it, I think I understand that when you're selling, when people are justifying fairness in their mind and they're buying something, it's very like you need to like there's this tendency or psychologically like I need to anchor on something, right? And when you anchor on something, you can anchor on sometimes the cost piece of it, like, hey, is this like what's the cost of it? And as a buyer, you can anchor on like competitive solutions. So those are the two traps that you fall into pretty easily because like it's a mental heuristic, like that's what I anchor on. And so you don't have to further think. And so the job is harder from a seller perspective to get them to appreciate the value, recognize it, and then the true partnership then sort of really emerges, right? So it's an easy heuristic trap to fall into, but it is what it is.
It is. It's hard. There's no doubt. I'll teach people, I'll work with people, they'll get it. And then, 3 weeks later, 2 months later, they say something that implies cost plus pricing.
Right.
And you're like, no.
Yeah, it is. I think part of the issue is like, because like, and we've different folks have like, you've probably written about it on LinkedIn and whatnot. It's just the abstract nature of value. In a lot of cases, people just have so many subjective interpretations of what value looks like. They have a sense of it internally, like, yeah, this is valuable to me, right? How valuable, to what extent valuable, how much more than an alternate, like there are nuances to it that people may not like get it from the get-go perspective. And so if I have to choose between abstract and something that I can see, like, yep, this is the cost. Like if I'm a product manager like this, it's cost me. So it's such a psychological thing to anchor on it so quickly versus like taking the time and effort to develop that understanding of value. But yeah, you're spot on. I can
And
imagine
Sagar,
struggles.
I just have to thank you for tossing me a softball so I can push my book for just a second.
Go for
Because because the new book, Selling Value, is really all about teaching salespeople how do your consumers perceive value. And if we could truly grasp that, not only sales, but product marketing, product management, suddenly we can do our job so much better. So
Yeah, no, I think
softball.
I think anything that I will be all over, especially coming from you. I think that is the single largest, like especially in a sales-led motion. That is like, you can argue in any motion, for example, but you can feel it directly in a sales-led motion where you can come up with the best things. But if your sellers and customer-facing folks are unable to build on that, then it sort of can crash pretty quickly. You can see that in the numbers. But no, I'm excited to read it. I'm sure everyone should
Absolutely
read it as well.
Thank you, Sagar. So last question before we play our game, by the way. Last question is, what's one piece of pricing advice you'd give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
I will say it's back to what you just weaving the theme of it. Like don't start with pricing, start with assessing value, quantifying it, understanding it, sort of like getting your handle on what value is with a specific feature or a product, how it scales, how customers perceive it, where do they start, where do they end. If you have an understanding of that, the pricing game becomes so much easier, because then it's more to do with like, what's the right value capture process or structure to do it. But don't start with pricing, please. That's the number one thing.
All right, definitely focus on value. Those of you who could hear, I just now am shuffling my card deck. We are going to play a game with Sagar. We're going to play pricing table topics with the impact pricing playing cards. I just pulled the King of Clubs. Are you ready, Sagar? You have to talk for 1 minute.
All right.
And no more than 2.
Go for
I'll
it.
give you 1 minute signal. Oh, this one's easy considering what we just talked about.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. Costs don't drive pricing. Willingness to pay drives pricing.
Costs don't drive pricing. Yeah, I think I want to touch on why that is, because a lot of people trip up on that, like why cost don't pricing. Because the fundamental thing is costs are internal, and you're like, why the hell should a customer care about your internal dynamics? Like, you as a customer, if you're a Netflix customer, who cares how much it costs Netflix to procure a movie or produce one? And like, you don't care, right? At the end of the day, what you really care about is, what is Netflix delivering? Is it delivering engaging content every now and then so that I can be a subscriber? Is it delivering a better cinematic experience? Like, what is it that's delivering? Like, why the hell should I care as a consumer, right? And so, the reason costs don't drive pricing is because I am paying for that value. I'm not paying for your costs. And if you can't have a business that, the goal of managing cost versus value is the business of the entity, or Netflix in that example. As a customer, I frankly wouldn't give a damn, right? And so the reason you, as a business, you shouldn't be doing that is sometimes you over-rotate internally because that's the only thing because it takes time and effort to understand what your subscribers are valuing, what they care to pay for, et cetera, et cetera. So it should be a no-brainer, but apparently it isn't. Costs don't drive value. Costs don't drive pricing. It should always be willingness to pay and value perception.
Nice job, Sagar. That was 1 minute and 25. That was perfect. Yes.
Sweet spot. Love it. I can only get better.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
LinkedIn is best. I'm very responsive with LinkedIn messages. Expect me to respond. I'm happy to. I've speak to so many people for all sorts of reasons, pricing or otherwise. But LinkedIn it is, Mark.
All right. We'll put your URL for your LinkedIn page on the show notes.
Appreciate
Episode 183 is all done. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? Also, if you like the podcast, your pricing colleagues might like it too. Please feel free to bug them a lot until they start listening. And finally, if you have any questions or comments about the podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact